Hello and welcome to another episode of Building Success, a real estate podcast. My name is Nick, and I will once again be your guide as we talk to some of the best and brightest in the worlds of real estate tech, operations, and financials from across the globe. This podcast would not be possible without listeners such as yourselves, so if you like what you hear and you want to hear more of it, please consider liking, subscribing, and reviewing the podcast wherever it is that you might listen to us, whether that be on Spotify, Stitcher, YouTube, SoundCloud. If you type in Building Success on Google, podcast will pop up. One way or the other, we appreciate you listening, and we'd love to hear your feedback. So please reach out to us and let us know how we're doing. On today's episode, I spoke with Sarah Larbi, and she invests in real estate in Canada. And this is a topic that we really haven't touched on in past episodes, which is the Canadian real estate market, how it's different from the United States and globally. There are some intricacies there when it comes to investing. There's a lot of things that are similar, but it was really fascinating to talk to Sarah and hear about some of her strategies regarding the types of tenants that she wants at her properties, and even how she decides which properties to invest in. So really informative, really enjoyed the conversation. I hope you do as well. And without further ado, here is Sarah Larbi. Well, thank you, Sarah Larbi, for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. I'm super excited to be on the show.
And before we get going on our topics today, and I do say topics because I feel like there's a lot of things that we can dive into, I'd like to get a little bit of a background on you and what's brought you to the real estate industry.
Yeah, so how I got into it, this was back in 2013. I remember going to the bank, and the financial advisor there asked us what our assets and our liabilities and what those were, and we literally had nothing to show for the amount of years that we spent working in the past. And so I went home and Googled how to become wealthy and how people get rich, and real estate kept coming back over and over, and that's how it actually happened. I became super obsessed with, that piece of potential freedom and early freedom and retirement, etc. And it just seemed like the most logical in my mind way to get there. I mean, obviously you can start a business, you can get into stocks and all that stuff, but real estate for me was the simplest way potentially for, in my opinion, to get to where my goals were. And so in 2013, my spouse and I, we bought our first investment property, which was actually his sister. It was $129,000, and it was the cheapest thing that we could afford, and so that's how we got started.
And just completely moved on from there and build to better and bigger and greater things. That's awesome. So you say you bought this property. What you didn't mention, and why I really wanted to talk to you today, is you're Canadian. And
yes.
So we are a global podcast in nature, and we've interviewed people from around the globe, but not Canada specifically. And that was one thing I wanted to touch on today, was the Canadian real estate market, something I don't know that much about. Just from a super high level, what are some of the major differences you've seen between the U.S. and Canada when it comes to real estate?
So they are mostly around taxes, financing, and prices of properties. Again, it depends where in Canada. Of course, you can go really far north where there's like nobody living there and you can buy super cheap houses. But in the areas where people do live, I mean, we don't really hear of $50,000 houses like you guys have in the US. So some of the concepts are the same. You're not really going to get like that 1% rule very easily unless you go quite out of the major market centers. But I would say the biggest two things would be the financing and the taxes. So when I'm talking about financing, we've got obviously the 5 or 6 big banks that we call them. So RBC, TD, Scotiabank, etc. And a lot of people that will buy real estate, they look at those 5 big banks. Some people say there's 6 of them, but and that's where they go. And then otherwise, in terms of financing, there's trust companies, and then there is credit unions. But essentially, like, we don't have like random private banks where you can wheel and deal with one specific bank and bank manager. Like it's just a little bit different here where it's all national banks. Yeah. And so that's quite different. And, the requirements for investment properties is that you put 20% down as the down payment, unless you're going to live in it, which at that point in time you can put a little bit less, depending on if it's a single family duplex, etc. And then the tax piece, you guys definitely have a better advantage. Yeah. Like we don't have such a thing as a 1031 exchange. So you sell the property, you're paying taxes. Unfortunately, you can't carry it over until to the next house like you guys can, right? And so there's a few things. And then the other thing I would also say is legally the structure in Canada is different. Like we would set up two ways, either personally in our own personal names. When you guys do investment properties, and I don't know the US market as well, but LLCs is always the thing that's recommended. But for us in Canada, it actually might be a recommendation to just keep it under your own name because you get such better financing terms, et cetera, and then not put in a corporation until you get, to your fifth or sixth or seventh as an example. But you'll be able to get that advice from your accountant, your mortgage broker, and your lawyer, and they actually might have different reasonings why you should or should not.
So it feels, and correct me if I'm wrong, is this in Canada, is it less loose than it is in the United States? You've got a little bit more rigidity with the larger banks versus, maybe a handshake deal in one of these smaller ones. But then between that and the taxes, it's a little, you need to be a little bit more smart with how you plan for the properties that you purchase.
Absolutely. It's definitely a lot more difficult. But there are ways around it. And like, this is why here you would want to work with a good mortgage broker so that they help you surpass. There's, everyone's got a financing wall. Usually after the fifth one, it gets quite hard to acquire more, but working with a good mortgage broker that has the connections with different credit unions or the different trust companies, like Equitable Bank as an example, is going to be really helpful. But yeah, it's not as easy as it is in the US. And in the US, you guys have programs where the down payment is such, small amount depending on, I think it's like if they're Army, et cetera, like 2.5% down payment doesn't exist here, or any of that stuff. And so it's definitely more difficult, but I don't think it's a horrible thing. I think that the thing to keep in mind is that because it's a little bit harder to get mortgages and financing, like we are a little bit of a safer situation than what happened in 2008 with you guys, right? In that sense. And so, yes, people are leveraged and potentially over leveraged, but it's still very much dictated by our financial system, which is run nationally.
So, fairly open-ended question for you. How do you personally determine a good property that's worthy of an investment versus a bad property?
Yeah, so I look at cash flow first and foremost. I don't think that there's like a good property or a bad property, but we don't necessarily have things that cash flow the same amount that you guys have. And so a lot of people that will come to me, maybe they've listened to a lot of American podcasts, they might say something along the lines of, I'm looking for something with that 1% roll or something with a 2% roll. And I think that unfortunately, like if you're looking at the fundamentals of buying into an area, and I have a fundamentals checklist on my website, but essentially, are jobs coming into the area? Is population increasing in that area? Are there multiple industries? Is transportation increasing? So those are all things that I will look for in order to pick an area or a market to invest in. The vacancy rates are another huge difference. I mean, our vacancy rates, as an example, in Southern Ontario, are not even 1%. We've got a huge shortage of housing and such demand. And because of the immigration, so we have about 400,000 people that come in, 260,000 of them come into the GTA, which is Southern Ontario. It's just creating an insane amount of demand, and there's just not enough rental properties. And the other piece of it, and I can speak on Ontario, is that the government limits you to how much you can rent increase every single year. But the market rents are going up like 10% or 15% a year, but we can only raise it, this coming year, as an example, 2.2%. So we, as investors, we actually don't want tenants that are going to be living there forever.
Yeah.
Versus you guys, you might say, I want a tenant for life. Well, for me, I'm like, if they're going to be there for more than 5 years, I'm going to be so behind on rent. They need to leave, and it's going to be hard to kick them out.
That's super interesting, though, because, keeping an apartment fully occupied, renting out single family homes, the occupancy rate in the United States is paramount to, this ever shifting rent scheme that you have right now in Canada.
Yeah. It's and just to circle back to your question, what's a good property? I look for a little bit of cash flow ultimately. If I'm buying a property in Brantford, Ontario, for example, I think right now they're going for about $300,000. You're going to put 20% down. You're probably going to rent that for, let's call it $1,800 a month. I am okay with that. If I was going to the US, I'm not. And the difference is that we do get appreciation versus I think lots of parts in the US. Mm-hmm. Of course, we've had some crazy appreciation, and we don't always bank on that, and that's icing on the cake. But that plus the mortgage pay down and a little bit of cash flow, and you're holding for the long term because of the housing issues that we're having in terms of so many people looking for property and places to live in, and they just can't find anything. It's just a solid investment overall. And so I look at those three things, but I don't necessarily need to be looking for the 1% rule where I'm investing, because I think over the long term, it's going to be, unfortunately, I think the middle class will be somewhat eliminated. And it's going to be investors that are owning the property, or people that have bought them, today in 20 years from now, that I just don't think there's going to be much available left for people to get into the market.
Well, you have this, and you mentioned this and alluded to it earlier, you have this fairly comprehensive checklist for determining the worth and value of a property. And I want to put that in the show notes for our listeners, because it's really convenient going kind of down the list and knowing what to look mm-hmm. for in the circumstance. And regardless of where you are, if it's Canada or the United States, I think a lot of those carry over regardless of region. Something else you mentioned on your website that I wanted to make sure I asked about was this, and tell me if this is right or wrong, this BRRRR strategy. It's
yes.
a B with 4 R's after. I was hoping you could dive into that a little bit.
Sure, absolutely. Originally, I was doing the buy and hold model, so we'd buy a property, put a tenant in, etc., and then hold on to it. But over time, because the prices are just dramatically increasing, I can't just get something turnkey anymore and put a tenant in and make any cash flow. Mm-hmm. And so in order to be able to, continue what I'm doing and not have to save for every single down payment, we started to renovate the properties and to bring up the value. So just looking for, so basically BRRRR, just so your listeners know, it stands for buying. So B stands for buying. Mm-hmm. The first R stands for renovate, then rent, then refinance, and then repeat. And it just allows investors and myself as an example to be able to recoup that money after it's been refinanced, put a tenant in with the highest amount possible of rent, and then go and buy that next property and repeat the same process over. When I first started getting into real estate investing, I didn't even think that people were able to do this strategy, that they had to save for every single house. And 20% in Canada on a $200,000-$400,000 house is quite a lot of money, and it's going to be a long time before you save for the next one.
Yeah, and so okay, so that's interesting. So when you say the repeat, that's referencing going to another property then, and not starting over and re-renovating the same properties or re-renting to new tenants or anything like that.
Exactly. So I'll basically buy something, renovate. Usually I try to just do like cosmetic stuff that's just going to be bringing up the value of the house. Like I avoid foundation stuff. I avoid a lot of the, stuff that's not going to bring up the value, like safety stuff. But I'll buy something that's just dated, that just needs to be, refreshed a little bit, $20,000, $30,000 of reno as an example. And then what I do afterwards is I will renovate that before I rent it. And then the tenant profile that I can get and the rent amount that I can get is going to be higher because people want a renovated property. It doesn't have to have all the bells and whistles, but people do pay more for properties that are renovated. And once I have the rents agreement, which the other thing is, by the way, I only do month to month. agreements, and we can talk about that if you want afterwards. But I don't like to sign yearly leases or anything longer than that. I just really like the month-to-month piece. But essentially, I show the bank the new lease with the new amounts. When the appraiser comes and all that stuff, they take a look at the current value of the renovated property, compare that to, what's been selling in the market. They may also look at the lease agreement just to say, okay, well, this is going to cover everything, even at a higher amount. And essentially that's what happens. And so the bank says, okay, well, your new property is now worth X amount more. Maybe I bought it for 220. It's refinancing for, it's now worth 300,000. I refinance that for 80% of the new value. The banks in Canada always want to keep 20% in the deal. And then you just basically, pay back your rental money, etc. And sometimes you can get all of your money back out. Sometimes you can get part of it, but it just helps with the, the numbers and the ROI, because ultimately, after you do this for a few times, you're just reusing the bank's money, and your ROI is really infinity, because you're not even putting in your own money anymore. You're just reusing the bank's money.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I want to get to the tenant piece of this as well, because we have a lot of listeners that invest in real estate, obviously, but we actually have a pretty big portion that are also operators and property managers of properties. And I typically like to ask, how do you keep good tenants? But I almost want to ask you, what is your ideal tenant profile? If you are someone who likes to work on a month to month, and because of the laws in Canada, the actual kind of changing out of tenants might be more favorable, what to you is an ideal tenant?
That is a great question. So I will say, where I invest, which is Ontario, it is so important to put the right tenant in the place, because it is going to be so difficult to kick them out. So I actually have like a 5-step screening process, like literally from, so basically I'll advertise myself on Craigslist, which is the Canadian version is called Kijiji. And then I have like a specific set of questions. So like usually one is like, tell me a little bit about yourself and your family. Are you smokers? Do you have pets? And like a phone number and your name. If they can't even answer that, like I don't even care. They're gone already. So let's just say, for example, I post an ad. I get 50 replies in the matter of 3 days. It's not uncommon. I might screen out half of them already because they can't answer those questions. And if they can't take directions from that, then they're not going to be able to take directions from when I need them to pay on time.
Sure.
And so then after that, I do call them. I still block my number. I do a phone screening. I have a whole list of questions. And you have to be very careful that you're not discriminating. So if I don't like somebody, I basically just let them know. I'll call them back when I have the dates for showing the property, and I just kind of don't talk to them for about 15-20 minutes at that point in time, the ones that I selected from the Craigslist Kijiji ads. And then based on that, like some of the questions will be like, how long do you want to live in the property? And to answer your question, I mean, if they say I'm really looking for my forever home, no, not for me, unfortunately, because again, like I mentioned, if the market rents are going up 15% a year, but I'm only allowed to increase it 2.2. I mean, after 3 years, I'm so far behind. Yeah. And they need to go. So then, that's one of the things I look for. And then the other piece of that afterwards is when they see the property, they fill out an application if they want to. Based on that specific thing, I will call the past landlords, current landlords. I will pull credit. And they go through that whole process. And then step 4 is I actually do an interview with them in person, face-to-face, just again to go through the whole application, any questions I have. And then finally, the last step is I sign the lease agreement. So I think it's just so important in a place where the laws are in favor of the tenants to really do your due diligence, because the whole experience of having a good tenant or a bad tenant can make or break everything, and your desire to potentially keep going. And at some point, everyone's going to have to go through, some people slip through here and there, but ultimately, I would never just give keys to the first person that says, here's like 6 months cash up front. It just doesn't make any sense.
So for you, and I know a lot of this is passive income, what is your kind of ideal I guess, number of properties that you feel, just as a solo investor, or if you do it with your spouse, how many properties is too many? What's that kind of sweet spot that you've found in recent years?
I mean, right now, let's just call it 10 properties takes me 2 hours a month to do, just because I've set them up where, I mean, I'm not the one going to do any reno work. And so if you have a good team set up in place, I don't think it's a matter of how many. I think you just need to set them up correctly. It's still very manageable right now at this point. Maybe another 15, potentially more at that point in time. You just hand over your portfolio, but I actually don't mind it. And because I do such a thorough job of finding the tenants and screening them and ensuring that they understand all the, rules, regulations. I mean, they're still paying customers. You treat them well, they'll, hopefully in return do the same. It's not as much work as people think that it is going to be if you set up the right team in place, which I would say usually if you've got a couple handymen, HVAC person, a plumber, an electrician. I mean, ultimately, you know how to text on your phone. Yeah. Something happens, your tenants will text you or send you a message, and you just dispatch whoever it is that you need to dispatch. And so that's what we've been doing since 2013. And of course, things happen. And, I'm not like handy at all. So I'm not the one that's going. And I think that's probably been a blessing in disguise. And the fact that I wouldn't be able to fix anything. I have to rely on other people.
And speaking of things that you don't have control over, one big piece that might be scary for people thinking about investing that may not already be doing so is the real estate market generally, right? And there's a lot of talk about a cooling off period with the real estate industry. Where do you see the real estate industry going the next, 1 to 5 years, and how will that affect your investment strategy?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I do get asked that quite often, like, aren't you worried about your properties? And here's my answer is that, like, where we're investing in Canada, I cannot speak about the US because it's a whole different market, but because of the issue with the supply and demand of housing and rents and people just not even like a lot of these areas are under 1% vacancy. Let's just say something happens to the market, and I don't have a crystal ball, but it goes down 20%. I'm like, I don't really care. I'm not losing any sleep. My tenants are going to stay. If anything, there's going to be more people that need to rent. Yeah. So our rents aren't going to go down 20% just because the house prices are going to go down 20% or whatever it is. And if it happens, it happens. But because I'm in this for the long term and I'm not flipping and I'm not, I'm holding on to these properties, I'm not worried. And, I would say a lot of the investors that are investing currently, I mean, like for us, we look at that as a potential good opportunity to just be able to snag some below market deals that, you hold on to for long enough and they'll come back up. It comes down, it'll come back up. And I would say just, if you sell and you panic, that's when you truly lose. Or where you really lose is if you're buying on speculation and you're not cash flowing a property because you bought in Toronto, as an example, where the rents don't cover the cost of the properties at this point. So you're paying for your tenants to live there, maybe a few $100s a month just to carry the place. Well, yeah, those people, I mean, they're going to be at a different spot maybe than somebody that's going out a little bit further from the city, maybe an hour and a half, 2 hours out, and finding something that at least the tenants cover all the costs. And those people that are doing that, those investors that are doing that, I don't think any of them really care if the market drops. I think it's an opportunity to buy more, if anything.
Yeah, the old Warren Buffett strategy of, buy big in the recession and, hopefully everything picks back up. But it sounds like with the real estate market the way that it is in Ontario, it's kind of a really good position for you to be in as an investor.
I think so. Ultimately, like, our fundamentals that you look for, right? And immigration's a big one. Like, unless they were to say tomorrow we are going to have no more immigrants come through for 10 years, like, which they're never going to say that. Yeah. That's a big part of what builds our economy, et cetera. And so, and I think that's the other piece is if you're looking for a market and you're going through that fundamentals checklist and you're picking based on, the fundamentals, the things that are important to look for in order for an area to keep growing and to appreciate to some extent over time, then I think people will be okay. And again, yes, it could go down 20%. Will it? I don't know. And I don't really care. If it does, then sure, okay, great. Let's deploy some cash and buy some more.
So tell me a little bit about your real estate investing club. I saw that on your website as well.
Yeah, so the RIGHT Club, it stands for Real Estate Investing, Training, and Education. So we started about 3 years ago. And I would say at this point, we probably have about 250 investors that come out every single month. Oh, wow. And they are monthly events, and we share and we educate on different topics. So, and it's not just us speaking, like we want the club to be about the people that are coming. And I think that's why we grew so fast, is it's education, it's networking, it's an opportunity for people to learn without having to spend thousands and thousands of dollars. I mean, it costs $50 at the door. They can get some passes if they want to pay a little bit less per event, but it's purely education. And there's tons of opportunity to network and find others that are like-minded. At this point, we're also launching online in the next, I would say, 3 months. So we're working the whole online division because we have a lot of people from Vancouver or across the country that can't come to those events that still want the content. Yeah. And so we are also about to launch a whole online community for Canada and for people wanting to get into investing and people that are already investing.
Well, great. And Sarah, thank you so much for your time today. You've mentioned a lot, this checklist, this BRRRR strategy, the Real Estate Investment Club. I don't think we've mentioned yet, but you also have a podcast, if not multiple podcasts. Yeah. Where can everybody find more information on you and what you're doing and all of these things that are happening?
Yeah, so I have 2 podcasts actually. One is called Where Should I Invest? And then the other one is called the RIGHT Club podcast. We have a podcast that goes with our club. But if they wanted to reach out, they can go to my website, which is Sarah Larbi, SarahLarbi.com, and they can have the information there. They can also go to our club. So if they're in the Burlington or the GTA area, the club is therightclub.com. And I'm also on Instagram, which is Investor Sarah Larbi. They can add me there, reach out to me there. And if they wanted the checklist, the fundamentals checklist, they could just download it off the website. On my website, it's on the first page there.
Perfect. Well, again, Sarah, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate you spending a half hour with me to talk about the real estate market of Canada.
Absolutely, it's super fun. I'm excited that you reached out and offered me a great opportunity for helping your listeners. And Nick, I should have you on my podcast as well.
Fantastic. So, if you want more information about Sarah, I'll put all of the links and sites that she just mentioned up in our show notes, and be sure to check out her website, sarahlarbi.com, for pretty much all the things that we discussed today. And until next time, listeners, we will catch you all later.